And once again, I'd like to welcome everyone to our Lab Los Angeles Birders webinar for tonight. We have a wonderful, wonderful program, but a bit about Lab first. We are an all-volunteer organization. Your membership is 100% of your membership and donations go into Lab supporting these live recordings, storing these recordings and presenting them, our community science projects. They go in to help our students in many different ways. Your dues and donations are well spent, and thank you everyone who is a member and has donated to the lab. We really appreciate it. And with that, I would like to introduce Desi Sieberth, who's a member of the lab board and a member of Lab S, to present our speaker for tonight. Desi.
Thank you, Ron. Tonight, we are very pleased to welcome back Kimball Garrett. Kimball hardly needs an introduction. I think we all know of him as a legend of Southern California birding and field ornithology. He grew up in Southern California and started birding at a very young age, and today is one of Southern California's most accomplished birders and is the leading authority on the birds of Los Angeles County. Kimball was the ornithology collections manager at the LA Natural History Museum since 1982. But he recently retired and now enjoys birding his local Antelope Valley patches. Kimball has a long list of publications, including some I'm sure many of us look at regularly. The Field Guide to Warblers of North America, The Birds of Southern California, Status and Distribution, and The Birds of Southern California. And as one of the leading ornithologists of LA County, Kimball has witnessed many shifts in bird populations and ranges over the last couple of decades. He will share many of these changes in his talk, the ups and downs and ins and outs of Southern California's avifauna. So please welcome Kimball.
Thanks, Desi. That means a lot coming from you. I appreciate it. I get to a point in my talk where I talk about Swainson's hawks, and maybe when we get to that point, I can cut away and have Lance present an update on Swainson's, then come back to the rest of whatever I was going to talk about. So
That's a
let
great
me
idea.
let me share my screen here, get into presentation mode, and let me know if it doesn't work.
It looks great.
Can you see that initial slide? It
Yeah,
should
it
be
looks
this
great.
blue bird with a fat beak. All right, cool. I'm gonna move this off to the side. Okay, well, I think Desi kind of introduced what I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to start with this slide because when we had our very first lab webinar nearly 4 years ago, I presented on the changing status of Vermilion flycatchers in Southern California, which has been pretty dramatic. And, don't worry, I'm not going to give that talk again. But Susan told me that especially the lab youth birders were really kind of craving more information along those lines. What other changes are we seeing, both expansions and contractions of ranges and populations and so on? So I figured that would be a good topic to just talk about, not everything, but a number of examples of birds showing these dramatic changes in their distribution. And we're always seeing these changes, of course. And so, my thinking is that young birders who probably have only been birding for a few years, plus older birders who started birding recently, don't have that history of having seen the changes that have happened over a period of decades, like some of us old farts do. So there's lots of ways we can learn about things that have changed even before our time. And, one of these approaches is to actually look at books and other literature and research papers and so on. And so I've decided tonight to take the approach of not really going through lots of data and numbers and figures and statistics of trends in distribution and population, but rather just kind of use my own experience over many decades of birding in Southern California to talk about the kinds of changes I've noticed over time And of course, decades from now, some of you young birders will be able to talk about other substantial changes that have happened between now and then. So I'm a big fan of books. I'm a big fan of the literature, and there's just a treasure of information there. So here's an example of my experience. When I started birding in kind of in earnest in the late 1960s, and then really sort of got interested in status and distribution in the early 1970s, um, things were pretty different in a lot of ways. And for example, if you wanted to see a peregrine falcon in Southern California, you pretty much had to go to Morro Rock and Morro Bay. There was a pair, a perennial pair, although the membership of that breeding population changed over time, but there was pretty much always a breeding pair on Morro Rock and essentially nowhere else accessible in Southern California. Nowadays, if you think of peregrine falcons, they're not abundant, but certainly they're widespread. You can find one just about anywhere. They nest in the centers of several large cities, both on the coast and sometimes in the mountains and deserts as well. In fact, the bird on the right I just photographed about a week ago sitting on a Joshua tree out in the Antelope Valley. And so this is just one of many dramatic examples of change in distribution in numbers. In this case, a positive change, and largely due to some heroic conservation efforts, as well as the reduction in the use of certain pesticides and so on. So definitely a success story, but the point being that there's just been a massive change in the status of the iconic peregrine falcon over the last few decades in Southern California. So I'm going to just give some other examples. This is a decline rather than an increase. And in fact, I noticed a couple postings on the Orange County listserv in the last few days about a couple white-winged scoters down there on the Orange County coast. It's almost a red letter bird these days. You don't see that many of them around. And yet you go back um, in time, and this was a very abundant bird in Southern California in the winter, not a breeding bird, of course, but a wintering bird along our coast. In fact, Grinnell in 1898 quotes and somebody saying this is the commonest scoter along the coast and the tide marshes. George Willett, in his treatises on the birds of southwestern California, called it a very common winter visitant along the coast. And there were counts of up to, believe it or not, over 1,000 birds sometimes in the mid 1900s, and even good numbers as late as about the 1970s and 1980s. Rich Bradley and Rusty Scalf used to do a bunch of bird surveys along the coast of Palos Verdes, and their counts of 165 birds, even greater numbers in spring. You could often go to points like Point Doom, and when the scoters are migrating by in April, and see sometimes dozens of white-winged scoters in a day. That must not sound very familiar to those of you who have only been birding a few years in Southern California. This bird has really declined. In fact, there haven't been any counts of white-winged scoters in LA County of double digits since, well, in the last 40 years. So what explains this? Well, we don't always know what's going on, but likely what's happening in this case and with certain other waterfowl and other species is a general northward shift in the wintering range, probably due to changing climate, changing water temperatures, changing prey availability, and so on. And so while there may be declines in the overall population of white-winged scoters, probably what we're seeing more than anything else is a shift in the winter range northward so that birds simply are not coming as far south. So this has been just one of many dramatic examples of change. Here's another one. I don't know when the last time you saw a white-tailed kite was in LA County or surrounding counties. There have been a few around, but we're talking almost single-digit observations in LA County over the last couple of years of a bird that used to be quite common. And when I say that, I recognize that they always had ups and downs. Kites were rare, they became common, they got rare again, the numbers went up and down. This is just some data from the Santa Barbara Christmas count over the last few decades. But the trend is undeniable. It's down. And whitetail kites, which sometimes could be found in substantial winter roosts of many dozens of birds, you're lucky to find a single bird now in winter and very few breeding pairs. So here's another case where birds of open country have disproportionately declined, and we're going to get more into some other examples. So this is just another really, I think, conspicuous negative trend. But I don't want to be too much of a bummer. We'll talk about some increases as well. Probably along those same lines, even common birds like American kestrel, many birders have noticed a decrease in numbers, fewer birds in urban areas. Of course, the loss of open fields and open habitats in urban areas has really impacted birds like kestrels. Um, Burrowing owls, of course, again, the loss of open habitats has resulted in some striking declines on the coastal slope, with very few breeding birds remaining and just occasional winter visitors. And even out on our deserts, their numbers appear to have declined. So these birds that eat small vertebrates and large insects um, seem to really have suffered a lot. Um, I don't know, maybe I'm not sounding the alarm bells about kestrels being threatened or anything, but I do certainly have noticed that they are far less routine than they used to be, and numbers seem to be diminished. These are some things again I've noticed, and a lot of these may involve range shifts. So we had back in the 70s and into the early 1980s some massive winter incursions of black-legged kittiwakes, sometimes hundreds of birds along our coast. And after some of the big winters, you'd even get birds in double digits sticking around through the summer. Nowadays, again, black-legged kittiwake is kind of a red letter bird, just a very few occurring along our coast and offshore. We know there have been declines in kittiwake populations, but again, this may be another case of shifting populations of birds staying farther north in the wintertime. Bonaparte skulls. It was routine to go to Malibu Lagoon back in the 1980s and see 500 plus Bonaparte skulls on the lagoon. Nowadays, you're lucky to see any. It's a hard bird to get on the Malibu Christmas count, where it used to be one of the most abundant ones. Now, I'm not saying they've disappeared from the area, because there are still sometimes some very large flocks of Bonaparte skulls just off our coast, off the Palos Verdes Peninsula, Redondo Canyon, places like that. They really like the sewage outfalls. But again, that has changed over the years, just what we're dumping into the ocean and how much Bonaparte skulls are attracted to it. So it's getting much harder to find big flocks of Bonaparte skulls right along our coast in places where they used to be abundant. So again, it could be just shifting habitats where they are. I've certainly noticed that Forster's terns are much less common along the LA County coast than they were 2 or 3 decades back. Again, it used to be a common bird in Malibu Lagoon in winter. You'd get a lot of them on the Malibu Christmas bird count. I think nowadays it's missed on most of those counts. Not that many anywhere else along our coast. And yet they're still fairly common in parts of Orange County and San Diego County and so on. And I'm talking about non-breeding birds. There are some local breeding populations like at Bolsa Chica and elsewhere, but this is just another bird that I used to be easy to find along our coast, and I see far fewer Forster's terns now than before. Ducks. Ithia ducks, the diving ducks like scaup and so on, used to be abundant in many of our inland reservoirs. You could go to places like Castaic Lake or Quail Lake or Pyramid Lake and see hundreds and hundreds of scaup, ringneck ducks, canvasbacks, and so on. Again, I think this is probably a case of shifting winter ranges, birds staying farther north as the climate generally warms, and it's more hospitable farther north than it used to be, so they're not coming as far south. That's again not to say that we don't have fair numbers of scaup, and I think ringneck ducks seem to be doing quite well down here. And certainly redheads, canvasbacks, and so on. but the numbers just aren't anything like they used to be. And that's bad news for people looking for tufted ducks down here because they seem to occur mostly where there's a lot of greater scaup or greater and lesser scaup. Um, and with the diminishing numbers of scaup wintering on our reservoirs, there's also been quite a decline in the number of records of tufted duck at the south end of their wintering range. Still, I think a very small number pretty much every winter in central and northern California, but boy, tufted duck has gotten to be a very rare bird. Well, it's always rare, but the numbers of records have really decreased in Southern California. Again, birds probably just staying farther north. It used to be you could go out to the Antelope Valley in winter where there were lots of alfalfa fields and irrigated agriculture and see some pretty substantial flocks of long-billed curlews through the winter and of course fields of mountain plovers. The curlews just don't seem to winter out there at all anymore. A lot of the alfalfa fields have dried up. There's much less irrigation. A lot of open spaces have become solar panel arrays. And it's just, even though we get migrant long-billed curlews coming through the Antelope Valley in spring and fall, we just don't get the wintering birds at all anymore. And mountain plovers, which used to be very reliable in a few places in the Antelope Valley, are now down to just a couple of small flocks in recent winters. Palmdale and a couple other areas, and just a much harder bird to find. So again, and I'll talk a little bit more about some other shorebirds coming up. So we know that grassland birds, birds of open country, and low stature open habitats have really suffered disproportionately. You're all probably aware of the paper Kenny Rosenberg and a bunch of co-authors published in Science a few years back on the loss of 3 billion birds in North America and these substantial declines of many kinds of birds in many different habitats. But one figure that they published in that paper that really stuck with me is this looking at the declines of birds by habitat. And if you look at the bottom on the graph up here in the upper left, grassland birds are showing more substantial declines than those birds of any other habitats. And this is certainly the case in Southern California. Largely because grassland habitat itself has largely disappeared or has been highly modified or turned into hardscape in urban areas or into high intensity agriculture or other habitats that are just not that suitable for many grassland birds. So again, we used to have western meadowlarks breeding in many open fields on the coastal slope of LA County. They essentially don't breed in those areas anymore, although there's still fair numbers in the interior valleys and the Antelope Valley. And we do get winter flocks, of course, but the breeding populations have really declined. The same is true of horned larks on the coastal slope as well. Really gotten to be a very rare and localized breeding bird on the coastal slope, whereas both these species used to be quite abundant. And another open country bird that has certainly declined greatly is the loggerhead shrike. Very different ecologically from the lark and meadowlark, but probably more analogous to things like the kestrel and the burrowing owl. But again, we've seen the loss of almost all of our coastal slope breeding populations of loggerhead shrike. And that's been pretty dramatic. Even the number of wintering birds on the coastal slope has really been reduced in the last couple of decades. They're still doing fairly well out on the deserts, but certainly on the coastal slope, urbanization has put a real dent in populations of all of these species and others. Short-eared owls with the loss of marshes and grasslands, grasshopper sparrows with the loss of suitable open grassy hillsides with scattered shrubs and things. Again, the grassland birds have really taken a massive hit. Isn't this depressing? I promise I'll get to some increases. Some desert birds, which would seem to be a little more immune to habitat modification, just because most of the urbanization has been on the coastal slope, but still we've seen declines in many things. And of course, the coastal slope populations of cactus wrens have really taken a hit. But even out in the desert, I think a lot of the suitable cactus wren habitat has been modified or 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 built upon or urbanized. And although it's not a rare bird out on the desert at all, its numbers do seem to have declined. And LeConte's thrasher has always been a tough bird to find. You know, they're secretive. They're kind of an art to finding them. And yet, if you go back to the 1970s, they were found in dozens and dozens of different sites quite regularly in the Antelope Valley. And now there's really just a handful of places where you can go and reliably find LeConte's thrashers. Some of that is because they're in habitats that have very few other birds, and so they don't get birded a lot. But the birders are out there trying pretty hard for LeConte's thrashers, and they're just a couple places in the West Antelope Valley, Edwards Air Force Base, and maybe a couple places still in the northeastern Antelope Valley where you can find them. But they've disappeared from the areas much closer to Palmdale and Lancaster, where they used to be relatively easy to find. Breeding populations of some of our birds have certainly taken a hit. We still get a lot of migrant Swainson's thrushes coming through, but they were breeding in almost any shaded canyon woodlands in the San Gabriel Mountains. Places like, oh, they breed in this, also in the Santa Monica's, places like the Panga Canyon, Malibu Canyon, and the San Gabriel's, Santa Anita, many other canyons. They've even bred a couple decades ago in places like Ken Malloy Harbor Regional Park in the riparian down there in the highly urbanized lowlands. And many of these populations have been greatly reduced now, and it's not nearly as easy to go out and hear that beautiful evening song of Swainson's thrush in these canyon woodlands as it was a couple decades ago. So again, just a pretty dramatic decline in the breeding populations of Swainson's thrushes. Yellow-headed blackbirds, of course, still migrate through, and you can get localized winter flocks, especially in the Antelope Valley. But we had several breeding localities in LA County a couple decades ago that are largely gone now. So there are big numbers at Holiday Lake, Paiute Ponds, several other just small marshy lakes out in the Antelope Valley. And now the breeding populations have largely disappeared. There's still a few likely breeding birds at Paiute Ponds and a couple other areas. But it's a bird that, again, as a breeding bird in the Los Angeles region, has really taken a hit the last couple decades. This one is a bit more of a surprise because certainly birding in LA back in the 70s and 80s and 90s, one would think of a brewer's blackbird as the ultimate in urban adapted bird. They nest in street trees and shrubs, can forage in almost any gutter or parking lot. And this was just a really successful urban bird. And yet, almost without our noticing in the last 10 to 20 years, these urban populations have really declined to the point where places that used to have big numbers of brewer's blackbirds in these urban habitats now they're very hard to find. That's not to say there aren't places where there's still plenty of brewer's blackbirds, but something's happened to them, whether it's an increase in predators, diseases. I know they're very susceptible to these mite infestations, although it's hard to say that that's really knocked these urban populations down, but it's possible that has played a role. But again, I don't know how many people have noticed, but there are places where 20, 30 years ago, where brewer's blackbirds would be abundant in highly modified urban habitats, and now they're either gone or just in much, much smaller numbers. So, and this is a decline that's been noticed in many cities over much of the West. So we also know to expect sort of booms and busts in non-native species. So perhaps the best example of that is the spotted dove, which was introduced around 1915. And as I grew up in the LA area in the 60s and 70s, this was just a common bird. You'd hear them everywhere. They were widespread through much of the coastal slope from Santa Barbara to San Diego and well into the interior, even out in some desert outposts. Now I think we can almost safely say that the spotted dove has been extirpated from the mainland of Southern California. The occasional report, but there haven't been any mainland LA County reports in the last year. So if you want to see a spotted dove, you got to go out to Santa Catalina Island, where there's still a handful in Avalon and elsewhere. We don't know why they've disappeared. We think that maybe an increasing suite of urban predators, such as Cooper's hawks, have probably played a role in their decline. And it might be telling that Cooper's hawks have been very scarce to absent on Catalina Island, where spotted doves remain, although Coopers are showing up there as well. And so the prognosis is not good if you want to continue to see spotted doves. So that was certainly a species that boomed and then went bust. And the northern red bishop's another good example. There were flocks sometimes of up to a couple hundred birds along the Santa Ana River, San Gabriel River, and other river systems in these weedy, marshy river bottoms and flood control channels and so on. But their numbers have greatly declined in really the last 10 years or so. There's still some spots along the Santa Ana River in Orange County where there are a few birds that are pretty reliable, but the big numbers are gone. We don't know why this has happened, but it just goes to show that you can never predict what's going to happen when non-native species get established. They seem to just be booming, and then before you know it, they've declined or are on their way out. So these are two examples of that. On the other hand, we have species of non-native birds that are still booming and continue to boom. Certainly the scaly-breasted munia continues to increase and spread in California, as do populations of their brood parasites, the pintail whitas. So these are still in the boom phase. But again, I'm not willing to say that this means that 10, 20, 40 years from now, they'll still be abundant and still be spreading. For all we know, they could disappear. It's just hard to know what the future will bring, whether diseases or subtle habitat changes or other issues will cause declines. But right now, these are two species that still seem to be on the upward trajectory in terms of their populations and their geographical distribution within California. And another good example of that, of course, is the Swinhoe's white-eye, which is still in the boom phase. And this has become one of the most common birds in urban and residential and park areas in coastal Orange County and in parts of southern Los Angeles County. They continue to spread. They're up to San Luis Obispo County now, and even have made headway into extreme northwestern Baja California. They haven't spread too much into the interior. They've just barely kind of gotten out into the Inland Empire, but they sure seem to be spreading. We now know, thanks to Devin Durad and co-authors, that these are indeed Swinhoe's white-eyes. These are very different from the birds in Hawaii, which are now considered a different species. The Japanese are warbling white-eye. We also know that these white-eyes in California are occupying areas that, based on ecological modeling, we would not have predicted they would do well. Just if you look at the physical environment of rainfall, temperature regime, and so on, they seem to be in areas where you wouldn't predict them to be able to colonize. But I think this is largely explained by the fact that we have modified these areas so much with imported water and irrigation and planting all sorts of non-native trees that bear fruit and berries and nectar and also attract insects that they rely on. And so they've been extremely successful. They're still on that upward boom phase, and we'll just see down the road what happens. But it's nice to have Devin and his co-authors work out published now just in the last few weeks. You might have heard house sparrows are declining. It's kind of a yes and no. They've declined in parts of their introduced range and not others. I've heard people tell me their house sparrows have virtually disappeared. And yet I don't see any shortage of house sparrows in most areas where I go. So it's hard to know. This is a eBird trend map of house sparrows in North America. Overall, they've still been increasing, but you can see, especially in the southern states, the red dots mean a decrease in abundance. We don't not really enough data from Southern California to show, but um, it wouldn't surprise me given what's happened with other introduced species if house sparrows um, take a downward trend in many areas. And of course, the rural habitats have changed. Livestock is much less prevalent, and so on. And even interesting things like on many college campuses where the house sparrow was kind of the campus trash bird, they've really been replaced by dark-eyed juncos, Oregon juncos, as the common campus begging little sparrow type bird, which is a really interesting change that's happened just in the last couple decades. So other status changes, again, I remember as a kid growing up in the Hollywood Hills, lots of breeding flickers. I remember seeing nest holes of flickers. Um, Nowadays, breeding flickers on the coastal slope have really become much more localized. They're still a very common bird in the mountains and some well-wooded areas, but it's not a common breeding bird in residential areas in on the coastal slope of Los Angeles County anymore. We get big numbers, of course, come in fall and winter, but the breeding birds have really, really taken a hit. Whether the availability of cavities is a problem, whether aggressive starlings, it's hard to know. Maybe even changes in ant populations, ants being a major food item of flickers. But we've certainly seen a major decline in breeding flickers on the coastal slope, even though, again, in fall and winter, they come in pretty big numbers. Other seasonal status changes. A lot of birds that used to be considered very, very rare in the wintertime and were thought to almost exclusively migrate out of Southern California. A lot of those birds are now becoming much more regular and expected in winter. Barn swallow is a good example of that, where it's routine to see small numbers of barn swallow, sometimes even fairly substantial numbers through the winter in Southern California. Even out on the desert, places like Paiute Ponds, you can get them through the winter. And so a lot of these are explained again by not the swallows, but some birds like overwintering orioles and western tanagers and various warblers and things can probably be explained by the planting of trees that provide nectar and insects and so on that allow them to survive and do well through the winter. Barn swallow is a little harder to say what's made them more successful through the winter, but it's certainly been a trend we've seen in the last couple of decades. Some of the obvious declines have been of shorebirds, um, and there's been a lot of work done on shorebird populations and declining populations. So this is a sort of a summary paper of the declines in North American shorebirds published about a year ago. And you can see anything below that zero line is declines, which is virtually all of the shorebirds with enough data to assess. And you see this massive decline if you look down on the lower left here of red knots, Hudsonian godwits, both dowitchers, Dunlin, Wimbrels, and so on, and also ruddy turnstone. And that's one thing, if you bird rocky shorelines of Southern California in the winter and have done that for decades, you will certainly have noticed a substantial decline of both black turnstones and ruddy turnstones wintering here. Now, again, how much of that is due to overall population declines versus shift in wintering range farther north? It's hard to say, but since some of these turnstones winter far south of here, I don't think it's simply a shift in winter range. And certainly part of it is explained by the declines in overall populations, which we've seen in a great many shorebirds. In fact, way over on the right side of the graph, it's really only a couple of prairie nesting species such as willet and marble godwit that showed either no declines or some slight increases. So again, shorebird habitat in LA County, there's just not a whole lot of it, and the conditions change from year to year, and in general are getting worse rather than better. So it's harder to find shorebirds here. But a part of that again is just the overall decline in the populations of most species of North American shorebirds. Well, we'll talk about some increases that have also been pretty dramatic. And I already mentioned the Oregon juncos, which in the last couple decades have really spread throughout the coastal lowlands, right down to the coast. It's a very common breeding bird now in residential neighborhoods and parks, right down to the ocean. Whereas formerly, if you go back 50 to 100 years, they essentially were montane birds that barely made it down into the foothills. And so this has been a really dramatic change. There's been a lot of work done on these relatively recent lowland junco populations in places like college campuses in San Diego, UCLA, and other places. Um, but it's just been a dramatic change. And now, you go on a pelagic trip out of Redondo Beach and you park your car in the morning and there's Oregon juncos singing in the parking lots right down on the ocean. It's such a dramatic change. Um, this same sort of movement into the lowlands happened earlier with bandtail pigeons. In fact, even by the 1970s, there were lots of bandtail pigeons in some of our sort of foothill fringes of urban Los Angeles. But that continues with more birds closer to the coast now. And the surprising thing is they seem to like ficus trees, and there's a lot of ficus trees planted in downtown LA. So you can routinely go to places like LA Live or Crypto.com Arena or whatever and see band-tailed pigeons flying around the ficus trees planted along Figueroa and so on. Again, a major shift from their normal pine and oak habitats in the mountains. But this is something we've seen now for quite a while. These I'm kind of calling natural range expansions, but they're not really natural. And so, again, great-tailed grackle, a very familiar bird in a lot of park lakes and golf courses and marshes and things on the coastal slope and the deserts. But really, we didn't have great-tailed grackles in California till the 1960s. They pushed up from Mexico through Arizona and into California, eventually hit the coast in the 1970s, and were extremely successful. Um, Now I say natural, but it's the modification of habitats and urbanization that really allowed this shift to happen, whether it's agriculture, livestock, urban parks, importation of water, whatever it happens to be. We've made the world a great place for our local world, a great place for great-tailed grackles. Same thing with Allen's hummingbirds. They were essentially limited to the California Channel Islands. We're talking about the sedentarius, the resident subspecies. But mid 1900s colonized Palos Verdes Peninsula and then spread up and down the coast and inland now, of course, widespread through pretty much all of the coastal slope of Southern California. And again, these are the resident birds. We still have a much less successful migratory population that breeds from about Santa Barbara County north to about the Oregon border. But the resident birds are now everywhere. They're aggressive. Everybody's got them in their yards and at their feeders. We have planted so much food for them that I say it's a natural range expansion in the sense that we didn't deliberately move Allen's hummingbirds or grackles for that matter into new areas. We just sort of built it and they came. We planted it and they followed. But it's been extremely dramatic, and Allen's hummingbird is certainly one of the most common urban birds in LA nowadays. And this again, if you bird in LA and you go to any golf course or park, and you're gingerly stepping to avoid Canada goose feces everywhere you walk. This is an abundant bird, Sepulveda Basin, but almost any park, and breeding in huge numbers. Well, this is very, very different from the situation a few decades back when we actually had migratory Canada geese that would come into places like the Sepulveda Basin for the winter, and then come March, they'd all get up and leave. And then the next fall, they'd come back. And so that was the natural situation here with migratory geese coming in and leaving. But something clicked. Um, Many birds stopped migrating, started breeding locally, and now, of course, it's become a very common year-round resident to the point where it's almost hard to even detect the influx of migrant birds coming in the wintertime. Certainly in urban areas, it's hard to even notice them because there's so many resident birds now. If you get out in the deserts in certain other areas, you might see migrant flocks of Canada geese. But even on the deserts, of course, if you've been to Apollo Park, you know the Canada geese do quite well there as a resident bird. So this has been extremely dramatic shift. And if you've only been birding a few years, it just seems like, okay, Canada geese, abundant resident, but it didn't used to be that way. We've seen other birds increase for no obvious reasons. You know, hooded merganser used to be kind of a red letter bird. If one got found, birders would go look for it. Just a very small number would show up in LA and Southern California in the wintertime. And nowadays, of course, they're much more routine with um, often double digits in many small ponds and lakes. Um, so that's been an increase, a bit of an expansion southward in their breeding range, but also much increased numbers in the wintertime in Southern California. White-faced ibis, again, used to be a pretty uncommon bird, very localized, just a few places where you could count on seeing them, and they're pretty much gone in the wintertime. Now we get good numbers of white-faced ibis year-round. You can even have big numbers out on the desert through the winter and migrants and so on. And so this is another bird that has definitely been on an upward trajectory in the last few decades in Southern California. Sometimes it's not so much a shift in numbers or distribution as it is behavioral change. So, um, believe it or not, Western gulls were a very, very rare bird anywhere inland from the ocean until about the early 1980s around Los Angeles. If you wanted to see a Western gull, you went to the beach or you went offshore or you went out to the islands. But something clicked culturally with Western gulls in the early 1980s, and they soon discovered that by going inland, you could find all sorts of trash and garbage and good stuff to eat. And they began moving inland in big numbers. And now, of course, Western gulls can be abundant in downtown LA and even some of the interior valleys, San Fernando Valley, San Gabriel Valley, in smaller numbers out into the Inland Empire. They're still not routine out on the deserts, but they've learned to move inland on the coastal slope. You can see literally thousands on the LA River up toward downtown LA. And they don't even move back to the coast for the nighttime. They live there in the industrial areas in the river. They don't breed there, but they certainly are there day in and day out. When in fact it's more the California gulls that come inland and feed in garbage dumps and then fly to the coast for the evening. But Western gulls, there's been this dramatic behavioral shift. And another, not quite so dramatic, but they've also begun to nest in small numbers along many of our harbors on pier pilings and so on. Whereas it used to be that pretty much only offshore rocks in the Channel Islands for nesting, but now it's a little more routine to find them nesting in many of our harbors. So again, a bird really adapted to humans and our modification of the landscape and all that lovely garbage that we provide. One of the most dramatic increases in the last few decades has been the establishment of very common urban populations of Cooper's hawks. Um, this was a bird that Audubon was putting on its blue list of threatened birds back in the 1960s and 70s. And now there's pretty much every backyard has got a breeding pair of Cooper's hawks. Um, we've created a food chain with bird feeders, small birds, and then Cooper's hawks to eat the birds that come to the bird feeders, and they've been extremely successful. And the same is true to a lesser extent of merlins. They don't breed down here, of course, but they have become more urban adapted in parts of their breeding range in the northern United States. Their numbers have probably increased, and we see them much more frequently in the winter down here than we used to. Again, this was a red letter bird. If a merlin was found, it was pretty exciting. And now merlins are, sometimes I see more merlins than I see kestrels in a day's birding. So again, a pretty striking change. And of course, we all know about how the corvids, American crows and common ravens, have become highly urban adapted. Again, crows were not abundant birds in a lot of urban coastal Southern California. In fact, there's a really rare bird in San Diego County. It's only really since about the 1960s and 70s that they moved in any significant numbers down into San Diego. Um, now, uh, and of course, ravens have become quite urban adapted. They nest on urban infrastructure such as, bridges and buildings and so on. And it's routine to see large numbers of ravens in the most heavily urbanized parts of the Southern California lowlands nowadays, whereas again, a few decades back, that was just not something you'd expect at all. This is another interesting one, Cassin's kingbirds, which were never a rare bird in Southern California, but pretty much limited to certain kinds of riparian habitats, sycamores, and so on. And yet, with our planting of other tall trees such as conifers and eucalyptus and silk oaks and many other things, they've found these changes in urban areas very much to their liking, and they've become much more widespread as a breeding bird and also much more common in winter as well. Again, partly because we've planted a lot of berry producing shrubs and they do eat a lot of berries in the wintertime. They also, like many kingbirds, like to eat bees. We got lots of those to eat, but this is just a bird whose status has, again, really changed. They've expanded geographically, they've expanded in numbers, and they're much more common in the wintertime and widespread than they used to be. They're even beginning to spread out into the fringes of the Antelope Valley. And with warming water, warming climates, we've seen birds, more southerly water birds moving northward. So again, elegant terns have moved up into California and after the breeding season in pretty big numbers since the um, early in the 1900s, but they didn't really begin breeding till about the 1950s in California. Royal tern, again, a much increased as a breeding bird and a wintering bird on the Southern California coast. And um, that's been quite dramatic as well. And of course, black skimmers really didn't colonize till the 1970s in California, and good-sized flocks and breeding populations. There's been a bit of a decline in the breeding populations of black skimmers along our coast in the last 10 years or so, but certainly still far more common than they were prior to the 1970s when they really weren't here at all. So again, we've seen several cases of these water birds pushing north that didn't used to be here. And of course, an extreme example of that would be the increase in boobies. Again, if you go back to the 1960s, early 1970s, if you want to see boobies in California, you kind of waited for a year when blue-footed boobies moved up into the Salton Sea, and sometimes some brown boobies with them. And on very rare occasions, you'd see one or both of those species along the coast in marine waters as well. Um, and pretty much no other boobies would ever be expected. Nowadays, of course, brown boobies have moved up. They're breeding on the Channel Islands in significant numbers. Red-footed boobies, mass boobies, and Nazca boobies are all pretty routine and regular, and so this has really changed. How much of this is due to warming ocean waters? That certainly has something to do with it. How much has to do with shifting prey resources? Um, we don't know, but it's certainly been a dramatic change in the last couple decades with the several species of boobies in much greater numbers than we would have expected earlier. And of course, these two birds have really moved in as well. So Neotropic Cormorant, again, unrecorded in California till I think it's like around 1970, maybe late 60s. Now it's become a very routine bird, pretty much anywhere in the coastal slope and the southern deserts where you can find double-crested cormorants. You're going to find neotropic cormorants as well. They're nesting in several areas of LA County now. Same with yellow-crowned night-heron, which has pushed up the coast. Now quite routine, significant numbers in like Point Magoo, regular up into San Luis Obispo County, and a relatively easy bird to find in LA County around the Bayona area and Alamitos Bay and places like that. So again, a dramatic shift. I don't know how much has to do with changes in prey items for these because fish populations on our lakes and ponds and things are always shifting and introduction of different species. Of course, yellow-crowned night-herons like to eat crustaceans, and I don't know, perhaps that prey base has changed as well, but certainly this is two dramatically increasing kind of subtropical water birds. We've seen some birds that have increased just largely because of successful conservation measures. So Swainson's hawks, the huge mortality on their wintering grounds in South America has largely been reversed now. A lot of protection for breeding birds, and even though it's still a very rare breeding bird in LA County, the numbers of migrants coming through have dramatically increased. Other examples of birds responding to conservation measures would be things like Bell's vireo and California gnatcatcher. Lance, I don't know if you want to say a word about Swainson's hawk migration this spring. I could stop sharing my screen. So if you confirm that you want to do that now, I'll stop sharing and you can just spend a minute talking about, and then I'll
Sure.
return. I'm getting close to wrapping up, but do you want to go ahead,
Yeah, sure. Let's give it a try.
Lance?
If something
Okay.
if something doesn't work with my slides, then I'll just speak without them. So,
Okay.
let's see. Here we go. So my video is not working though. Are you seeing my slide?
Give it 1 second.
Not,
No,
not
not
yet.
yet.
Just seeing all black.
Oh, all black.
Yes.
Okay, let me just speak then. We'll forget about showing the slides. So yeah, the Swainson's hawks are migrating again through the area. I think kind of the short thing to say is that we're going to try to get together a line of observers this coming Saturday to try to basically see where they're going and if things work well, possibly even track movements of individual flocks. I'm going to post a message on the LA County and Inland County listservs about this to facilitate communication and provide more information about where to look, what time, what to note, and so forth. But the birds are moving through already. They are staging again in Anza Borrego and apparently in the Imperial Valley. Compared with last year, though, the numbers are lagging significantly. There are flocks moving through, but we are not finding, at least not by eBird reports and a small number of personal communications, the substantial numbers we saw last year. It's not yet clear what's going on, whether they're just coming in late or if they just aren't coming in at all. But there are some pretty pronounced differences, at least by this time in March. So far this year, the largest counts that have been reported in Los Angeles County were between 40 and 50 birds in Monrovia and Benelli Park. There was one report over in Nuevo and Riverside County that also reported a similar number. Other than that, though, there haven't been any really big flocks yet, whereas this time last year there had already been quite a few. So pay attention to your email, and the next day or so, I'm going to post a message on both the LA County and the Inland County listservs to try to coordinate this. We're going to try to do it on an east-west transect um, to get as many observers as we can. Ideally, if possible, we'd love to have people from the basically from Gorman area all the way out toward Palm Springs. So we'll see how that goes. So I think with that, Kimball, why don't you go ahead and continue? Thank you.
Thank you, Lance.
Okay. Thanks, Lance. Thanks for that word from our sponsor. Oh, let me go back. Here I am. Okay. I hope my screen is showing now. And so Swainson's Hawk certainly responded well to conservation measures, which is encouraging. Um, I'm just kind of speculating here, but I think some of the marine species may also be increasing because of protection on their breeding grounds. And I'm sure that's the case with Cook's petrel. There have been some really important efforts by the New Zealanders on their breeding islands of Cook's petrels to eliminate predators. And that may be one reason we're seeing increased numbers off our coast and including closer to shore than we would have expected before. And to some extent, this may be true of other birds that are receiving conservation attention on their breeding grounds, like black-vented shearwaters and perhaps even the Guadalupe Island breeding merlets and storm petrels as well. So that's a very encouraging trend that some of these seabirds are responding well to this predator elimination on their breeding islands. I want to just kind of end with some thoughts on the numbers of trends of vagrants that we find in Southern California. If you look at the numbers, many vagrants, and I'll talk about a couple warblers as examples, seem to be increasing in numbers, but it's really hard to tell. And this brings us back to what I talked about with Vermilion flycatchers. Are they really going crazy and expanding, or do we just have more bird watchers everywhere to find them? And I think that was a case where the answer is probably both. So as we see, for example, increasing numbers of vagrants in Southern California, is this because we have more birders and more intensive coverage looking for them? Is it because we know more about where and how to find vagrants? Is it because we're more aware of identification issues with some of the difficult to identify vagrants? And also the ease of reporting. Again, 30, 40 years ago, we probably never heard about a lot of reports because it wasn't easy to just hit a few buttons on your phone and enter it into eBird and so on. So it's hard to say what the trends are. But the ironic thing is some warbler species, for example, that we know are decreasing overall in their population seem to be increasing in number of records here in Southern California. So just a couple of examples. So on the left, if you look at, I've divided into roughly 5-year periods, although the most recent period at the bottom lasting a little longer because there are a couple of years for which we have no data due to things like COVID and the temporary demise of North American Birds magazine. But the numbers of black-polled warblers in Southern California since 2000 by roughly 5-year period have remained fairly steady. And yet populations of black-polled warblers are known to be declining range-wide. So what might very well be happening is fewer black-polled warblers are showing up in California, but more of them are being found because we have more birders out there scouring every single park and so on. So the number of those two are kind of opposing trends, which result in roughly equal numbers over the last 20 plus years. If you look at Tennessee warbler species, which again has shown some slight increases overall according to eBird trends, but the numbers, that's 2000 to 2004, not 1004. My data don't go back that far, but you can see this apparent large increase in the number of Tennessee warblers being found. And I think that is not explained by increasing populations or increasing tendency toward wandering out of range, although I suppose that's a possibility. But I think this is largely just due to more birders out there finding more and reporting more Tennessee warblers. So you can see how we basically like tripled the number found per fall in the last 20 plus years or so. So um, it would take a lot of analyses to really see what's going on in terms of true trends and also to tease apart birding effort. Um, the thing is, eBird has changed things so dramatically, but even the eBird trends really only go back about 10 or 12 years because they recognize they just don't have the data in eBird once you get before about the year 2010 to really make these analyses. But if we can find a way to really quantify observer effort, um, we might see some interesting trends in the occurrence of vagrants. And here's an example. Common grackles were never recorded in LA County until 1997 when we had our first county record. And in the following years, we had multiple birds in several years on up through 2010. And then since 2010, what's happened? Zilt. We've not had a single common grackle in LA County. This is a bird, again, a very successful, very abundant bird. Their breeding range was pushing west, and it seemed like this was going to be a very routine bird in California as a vagrant. And then all of a sudden, just the tap went dry and they stopped showing up. Turns out, actually, somewhat to my surprise, that there's quite a significant downward trend in the overall populations of common grackles. And their numbers have declined pretty much throughout their range. And that's probably why they just pretty much stopped showing up. Now, there's still been some common grackles in California showing up since 2010, but very few. And so it just kind of goes to show you can't predict what's going to happen. And the future years are certainly going to show some interesting trends, both positive and negative, in vagrants as well as breeding populations and so on. So let me just close by talking a bit about the future. I'm not stupid enough to make any predictions about the future, but what I will say is there are a lot of young birders that are listening tonight and increasing numbers of very talented young birders. And you're the ones who are going to be talking 30, 40 years from now on the changes that have happened between 2024 and, 2064 or whatever it happens to be. I wish I could hear your talk, but I probably won't be around. But so please just record data, go out and bird in a way that you're kind of doing repeatable surveys, put it into eBird, help us really monitor trends, get involved with projects like maps, banding projects, and like breeding bird surveys and so on that help us monitor bird populations. And I think it would be a really interesting talk to hear 2, 3 decades down the road on the changes that have happened in those ensuing years. And you guys are going to be the ones to do it, and that's pretty exciting. So I'll close with one prediction. Who knows what will happen, but if you look at the distribution of limpkin sightings on the upper left here between 2010 and 2015, that's pretty much the classic range of limpkins, Florida and the Neotropics. If you look at the last 5 or 6 years, eBird sightings, there have been limpkins scattered through virtually all of eastern North America on up as far as Nova Scotia and Quebec and places like that, and west of Boulder County, Colorado. This bird on the lower left was photographed last year in Boulder, Boulder County, Colorado. And including also they've moved farther north in Mexico, virtually up into Sonora now. And so I'm not saying we're going to get a limpkin, but the trend is certainly such that it wouldn't shock me. As you know, they eat Pomacia snails, apple snails, There are various species, but one of the invasive species got well established in Echo Park in recent years. They may have been wiped out now, but they were really well established. I'm not saying you should go out and seed every pond between Boulder and here with apple snails to bring a limpkin here. In fact, that would be illegal. But the trend seems to be such that I won't be shocked if some enterprising birder at the, Raymer Lake or the Colorado River or Harbor Park or wherever it happens to be finds a limpkin one of these days. So that's my prediction for the future. And with that, I think I will entertain some questions if there are any in the chat or the Q&A. Thank you.
There are. Thank you very, very much, Kimball. That was wonderful.
Yes, thank
And
you.
let me
Um,
go to that.
so we
And
have some questions in the
yes,
Q&A, and for the people on YouTube can't see the questions, so we're gonna read all of them. Mary asks, where would your AV peregrine that you had, where would it nest? Any reports of nesting in the mountainous areas of the AV?
I don't know, Mary. Of course, peregrines move so widely; they're very routine at Paiute ponds, and yet they obviously don't nest right there. So, I'm guessing they probably are using cliffs and ledges in some of the more rugged mountains surrounding the Antelope Valley. I don't know of any birds nesting on urban infrastructure in the Antelope Valley as they do in LA and Long Beach and other areas. But there's probably a couple peregrine pairs up in the high San Gabriel Mountains on cliffs that may um, forage as far out as the Antelope Valley. So I don't know. Good question.
hmm cool.
Okay, great, thank you.
Oh,
Bob asks, what?
I'm sorry.
Yes.
Just to remind everyone, if you have a question that you would like to ask Kimball, pop it into the Q&A down below, so that helps us keep track of everything, so we don't miss anything. Thanks.
Mhm.
Sorry, Mark.
Oh, great, great, yeah. Bob asks, do you think juncos were coastal, uh, then lost to house sparrows and then returned, or is their expansion new for them?
No, the expansion is new. There's no evidence of breeding juncos in the lowlands south of San Luis Obispo County. Um, and that kind of stuff is pretty well known. The early ornithologists were pretty good about breeding ranges and collecting eggs and things like that that would prove breeding. So, um, no, and again, I don't even know the relationship between house sparrows and juncos. It's more correlation than causation, perhaps. But the fact that juncos have become common campus birds and house sparrows have largely declined on campuses. But um, no, this is a case where we know pretty well the timing of the invasion of the lowlands by juncos, and it's all really in the last 2 to 3 decades, depending on, and really even more recent than that
Yeah.
in large parts of the LA basin.
Mhm. Great.
Should I just go down this list, or do you want to?
I can keep on going, yeah. Alex asks, how has West Nile impacted our native corvids, and what's the outlook for our scrub jays and I guess our California scrub jays and island scrub jays? They've been gone in my area around 2020 and haven't come back in large numbers.
Hmm. Well, yeah, of course we know that the West Nile severely impacted most of our native corvids. Um, Crows seem to have largely rebounded, and ravens. Well, it's hard to believe ravens were ever even that affected. They've just become so abundant. But scrub jays were definitely hit. Island scrub jays, from what I've read, West Nile is not known to have impacted island scrub jays, but of course the potential is there. Um, but California scrub jays, I agree, have not rebounded in a lot of areas where they used to be pretty common. And whether that's all due to West Nile or some of it's due to just increasingly dense urbanization, it's hard to say. They were routine birds in Exposition Park the first 10 or 20 years when I worked at the Natural History Museum. Then West Nile virus hit, and I've only seen a couple of scrub jays since then. But then that's not ideal scrub jay habitat, so it's hard to know. But yeah, the impacts of West Nile are still, and that's a big concern, of course, for island scrub jays. That if it takes hold out there. But yeah, we've definitely seen that for California scrub jays. A lot of areas where they've declined, they haven't really rebounded fully. And other areas they seem to be doing quite well. So it's kind of a hodgepodge.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Lily asks, do you think that there have always been these types of changes even before European colonization?
Lily, the answer is yes. There have always been lots of changes. We just don't know what they are. It's a little hard to study population and distribution changes prior to. You basically have to look at the fossil record and um, indirect ways of, but I think change is constant. So we know there have always been shifts. So, for example, climate change has impacted bird um, differently than the current climate change crisis, but it's always impacted birds. And we know that ranges have shifted with, for example, the glaciations and the ice ages, and birds contracted into small refugia that weren't glaciated and then expanded when the glaciers melted and so on. So yeah, change has always been happening. It's just I wish we had a time machine to go back a few thousand years and see exactly how things were changing.
Mm-hmm. Yvonne asks, analyzing eBird effort is surprisingly complicated. I wonder if you have an example of an analysis someone has published for any species.
There have been a lot of them. One thing I would highly recommend is going into eBird and clicking on science and looking at their new trends maps. So they have both trends in geographical distribution and in abundance. Um, and there's a huge amount of information there. Not all species can be analyzed with confidence because of lack of data, but they've done some trends maps that are highly detailed for a large number of species. And so, and more there are papers being published using eBird data to look at trends in populations and so on. So yeah, but I would start by looking at the science articles and trends maps in eBird.
Okay. Mary asks, what's the status of long-billed curlews and mountain plovers before agriculture was introduced in the AV?
Good question. I don't know. I haven't been birding that long. Yeah, I mean, you kind of look at what did the Antelope Valley look like before agriculture, before grazing, before urbanization, and so on. And I suspect a lot of it was. It's hard to say. There are probably some grassland areas that would have had curlews and mountain plovers. There are probably a lot more shrubby areas with Joshua trees and desert shrubs and things that were all scraped away. And of course, those would not have had curlews and mountain plovers. So, um, yeah, I wish I knew the answer to that, but I don't. I don't know enough about the history of habitat change in the Antelope Valley.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thomas asks, I read in Living Bird that the wetlands birds have been increasing. Have you noticed this change, and if so, regarding what species?
Again, if you look at that paper on the declines of North American birds that was published in Science, the Rosenberg et al. Paper, they break things down by habitat and by the different groups of birds. And in general, waterfowl have done quite well. I think partly because there's a huge economic interest in managing for waterfowl and making hunters happy. Um, so wetland birds I think wetland birds, it's relatively easy to create certain kinds of wetlands. So while shorebirds have shown some dramatic decreases, a lot of other wetland birds, sort of herons and other large wading birds, waterfowl and so on, and surprisingly also raptors have done much better than most other groups of birds because of successful conservation and habitat efforts. So that's true. The wetland birds have been, in general, more of them increasing than birds of most other kinds of habitats.
Interesting.
Mhm.
Presenters can't put questions into the Q&A, but Lass asks, what about changes in abundance distribution of montane species? We have had a dramatic decrease in American dipper, for example. Do you know about these changes?
Well, I think in general, a lot of our local mountains seem to be drying out. Um, again, climate change, and some of it may be just habitat modification. I think another dramatic decrease in our mountains has been calliope hummingbird, which used to be a very reliable breeding species at many different willow patches along the Angeles Crest Highway, and virtually gone as a breeding bird now from the San Gabriels. Dippers, of course, are habitat specialists.
Mm,
Uh, hard to say. I would think that, their habitat can be great some years and non-existent other years. There's also a lot of human disturbance along fast-flowing streams and rivers in the San Gabriels, which might impact dippers. But yeah, there have been a lot of decreases of montane birds. Calliope hummingbird is certainly one I would add to dipper. Um, so yeah, hopefully when we do another breeding bird atlas, we'll be able to quantify some of those changes. I see, just looking through the list here, I see a question about osprey populations.
Mhm.
Again, that's a bird that's increased as a breeding bird. Didn't breed in the Los Angeles area several decades ago, and there are a few local breeding pairs now. So that's been success. But again, a lot of that's due to management, and
yeah.
also the stocking of certain kinds of fish in artificial reservoirs and things. And then there's a question about somebody else has noticed a decline in Brewer's blackbirds. Well, that's really been a pretty clear-cut trend. Any theories on varied bunting? And this is from an anonymous attendee. I know that there's that one record of a small flock in Riverside in the early 1900s. It's actually the Colorado River in Riverside County. Um, that was kind of a bizarre flock of varied buntings, but other than that, it's just shown up a handful of times as a vagrant. I haven't noticed any obvious trend in increase in numbers, so on. It's still such a rare vagrant in California that um, there's really not much data to try to make any interpretations on trends.
Hmm.
Is there a possibility of Western cattle egrets taking over the rest of Southern California from the Salton Sea area? Um, I'm not worried about it. Um, actually, cattle egrets have declined in the Salton Sea area and then declined in most of the other parts of California as well. So they don't seem to be taking over, but it's going to depend a lot on the trends in agriculture and water use in the Salton Sea. I mean, it was just cattle egret heaven for several decades in the 70s and 80s and 90s, and with the cutting off of water to lots of agriculture, I expect that they're going to do more poorly than they used to.
Um,
Red-breasted nuthatches, well, they've always been so irregular that it's kind of hard to say. Because their numbers this winter be due to successful breeding or food supply? Yeah, probably. Maybe a combination of lots of red-breasted nuthatches and then food failures of food crops near their breeding range, so they move farther. But yeah, these invasive, erratic birds like red-breasted nuthatches um, they're, some of them are pretty well studied, but it's still kind of hard to know what causes these periodic eruptions.
Yeah. Now,
Wood storks move.
yes. Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Wood storks move. Oh, just a question from Yvonne. If wood storks move north or east of the Salton Sea, they don't even move to the Salton Sea anymore. Wood storks stopped occurring in California. Um, Again, you could go back and see hundreds some years in the summer post-breeding birds at the Salton Sea back in the 60s and 70s, and then they just stopped. I'm not sure when the last wood stork was at the Salton Sea. There's one or two individuals that wander around from San Diego County north to recently Ventura County, but that's it for wood stork. So no, they've moved, they've ceased to occur basically.
Yeah, unfortunately.
And here's a
Another
question I don't know the answer to this one. Have there been any improvement in the number of common terns on the coast in pelagic California? Um, I don't know. I guess improvement depends on whether you like common terns or not. So I assume you mean increase in numbers. Common terns, ironically, have never been common in Southern California. There have been some, pretty substantial flocks here and there at certain places, but it's always been a very uncommon bird here. I don't know of any strong trends in the numbers of birds offshore, but I don't think there's been any obvious upward or downward trend. But it's never been a common bird in Southern California.
Hmm.
And I don't know, maybe this will be the last one as we're running kind of late. But
Yeah.
is it getting harder and harder to get non-roadrunner cuckoos in Southern California, if at
Yeah.
all?
Yeah.
Well,
always do.
what are your choices? Black-billed cuckoo,
Well built.
one or two records, so don't hold your breath on that one. Yellow-billed cuckoo has greatly declined from a fairly common breeding bird to virtually eliminated from most of Southern California as a breeding bird, but the occasional bird does come through, and occasionally in June or July there'll be one out at Paiute Ponds. Groove-billed Ani is the only other non-road runner cuckoo in Southern California, and there's again a handful of records, but no clear-cut trend. There is a Northern California record for common cuckoo, the old world species, but I'm not holding my breath for one down here. But no, if you want to see a cuckoo in Southern California, you're probably going to have to settle for roadrunners.
Yeah. Sounds good.
Um,
Okay.
we have a question about Native American middens also.
What's a
Yeah, there's been some really good work done in middens on the Channel Islands and some on the mainland for bird information, as well as, of course, some important paleontological sites. And of course, we have the Rancho La Brea deposits, which give us one of the best paleontological records of virtually any place in the world. So there's a tremendous amount known about that. It's kind of hard to be quantitative and say, we have X number of bones of this species from this midden, and therefore its trend has been up or down. But there's some birds surprisingly well represented, like short-tailed albatross is a good example, represented in middens that we was virtually extinct for a while, and there have been a few recent short-tailed albatrosses off Southern California, but they have not recovered in the numbers that they had before the big population declines, 100+ years ago. Anyway, thanks for all the good questions.
Yeah, well, thank you, Kimball. This has
Yes,
been
thank you very much,
very
Kimball.
nice.
That was wonderful. And I learned what middens are. I did not know. Anyways,
It's what
thank
you put on your hands when it's cold.
you. Thank you very, very much. Please join us next month when Desi will be presenting on loons. And And if you have any questions about LA birders, you can go to our website at labirders.org, where you can also join or donate. And once again, Kimball, it was wonderful. Our chat is full of thanks. And we're lucky to have you around with us. Thank you very much. And
Thanks, everybody.
with that, we will see everyone next month. And take care, everyone. Bye-bye now.
Yep. Bye. Thank you, Kimball.
Good night.
Thank you,
Bye all.
Kimball. Learned a
Bye-bye now.
ton.